Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1. Before the Highways, Paths Across a Wide Country. Imagine, for a moment, that you are looking down upon the continent from a great and quiet height. Below you, there are no glowing ribbons of pavement, no rows of headlights tracing the darkness, and no green signs standing patiently at the edges of fields. There is only land, arranged in the slow patterns that water, stone, and weather have shaped over countless years. Rivers wind through low valleys, silver in the early light. Mountains rise in long, folded ranges. Between them lie gaps and passes where the ground softens enough for travelers to move through. Plains stretch toward the horizon, broad and unhurried, while coastlines curve gently where the land meets the sea. This is the land as it was long before the interstate highways, long before the automobile, and long before the first federally supported road. Yet it was never empty, and it was never without paths. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of North America traveled along extensive networks of trails. These routes connected settlements, hunting grounds, fishing waters, waterways, ceremonial places, and distant regions where people exchanged goods and knowledge. They were not crude marks upon an untraveled wilderness. They were routes chosen with care, refined over generations, and closely adapted to the shape of the land. A trail might follow the gentle curve of a ridge, where the ground was dry and the view was long. It might trace a river through a valley, follow a shoreline, or pass through the one low gap that allowed a mountain range to be crossed with less difficulty. Some of these corridors are remembered by names that remain familiar today. The Natchez Trace linked the Mississippi River region with the Cumberland settlements farther to the northeast. Travelers moved along this corridor on foot and later on horseback. Its history reached back long before it appeared on European maps. In the Appalachian valleys, a broad web of routes is sometimes called the Great Indian Warpath. It was not one engineered road. It was a network of practical passages through the long valleys and mountain gaps, shaped by geography and by repeated use. When colonists and later settlers moved inland, they sometimes adopted portions of routes that were already there. Those paths had already answered one of the oldest questions in travel. Where does the land allow an easier passage? A path suited to walking might later be widened for a horse. With more clearing, it might carry a wagon. In time, portions might become roads. The lines drawn on later maps were sometimes much younger than the routes they represented. Still, moving heavy goods over land remained slow and difficult. For a long time, the easiest roads were not roads at all. They were waterways. A river could carry grain, timber, or stone with far less effort than a team of animals pulling a cart through mud. Coastal routes joined one settlement to another. Where nature had not provided a convenient channel, people sometimes built one. The Erie Canal opened in 1825. It connected the Great Lakes region to the Hudson River, and through the river to the Atlantic coast. Barges moved along its calm surface, while animals walked on the towpath beside the water. A towpath was simply a path used by the animals that pulled canal boats. Canal water slipped beneath bridges. Cargo moved east and west. Towns grew beside the route. Trade and migration began to follow new patterns across a wide portion of the country. There were important overland projects as well. The National Road, also called the Cumberland Road, began construction in 1811. Over the following decades, it reached westward from Cumberland, Maryland, to Vandalia, Illinois. The National Road was an important early road supported by the federal government. Wagons rolled along it, and travelers followed it toward the interior. In some sections, turnpikes also appeared. A turnpike was historically a road supported partly through tolls paid by those who used it. The National Road mattered greatly in its time, yet it was not a direct ancestor of the complete interstate system. It was one thread among many in a long and unfinished history of connection. During the 19th century, railroads expanded rapidly. They changed the experience of distance. Journeys that had taken weeks could sometimes be shortened to days. Steel rails crossed plains, followed river valleys, and climbed through mountain passes. A distant train whistle drifted over open farmland. carrying the suggestion of places far away. But the railroads did not simply replace roads, canals, rivers, or coastal travel. These different forms of movement overlapped. A family wishing to reach a railway station still needed a local road. A farmer bringing goods to a train might travel the final miles by wagon. Many communities remained dependent on rough roads that were vulnerable to every change in the weather. Rain could turn dry soil into deep mud. Wagon wheels pressed into the damp earth, making ruts that held still more water. Frost could lift and crack a road surface. Spring thaw could soften the ground until it was nearly impassable. Snow might cover the road and soften its edges, leaving a community isolated for days. To travel was to negotiate with geography and season. The country was wide, and its landscapes were varied. Roads in a dry plain faced different problems from roads in a wet valley. A mountain passage required grades and curves. A river required a ford, a ferry, or a bridge. Every route was a conversation between human intention and the land beneath it. And so before the highways, the continent was already crossed by many overlapping forms of movement. There were footpaths and trade networks, rivers and canals, wagon roads and railway lines. Each served different travelers and different needs. None erased the others entirely. Beneath them all was an enduring wish, older than any government and any machine. It was the wish to reach the places beyond the horizon, to exchange what one community had with another, and to draw the distant a little nearer. It was onto this land, already shaped by so many kinds of travel, that a new sound eventually came. It was not the creak of a wagon or the whistle of a train. It was the small, uneven sound of an engine approaching along a country road that had never been built with such a machine in mind. Chapter 2. The Arrival of the Automobile. The automobile did not arrive upon empty ground. It arrived on roads made for earlier forms of travel, and this simple fact shaped the early history of driving. The first automobiles appeared in the closing years of the 19th century. They were expensive, uncommon, and often unreliable. Some were owned by wealthy travelers, others belonged to people fascinated by engines and mechanics. Then, during the early 20th century, mass production lowered prices. What had been a novelty gradually became an ordinary possession for a growing number of families. More people found themselves in command of an engine and a set of wheels, and they began to ask where those wheels might carry them. The roads beneath the tires had generally been intended for pedestrians, horses, wagons, and local traffic. Their surfaces varied greatly. Some were packed dirt, dusty in dry weather and difficult in rain. Others were covered with gravel. In towns, a road might be laid with brick, timber, or stone. Road builders also used macadam, a surface formed from compacted layers of small stone. These improvements were uneven. A traveler might move comfortably for several miles, with gravel shifting softly beneath narrow tires, and then find the road dissolving into ruts and mud. The desire for better roads did not begin with motorists. Before automobiles were widespread, bicyclists, farmers, postal officials, merchants, and other travelers were already asking for roads that could be used more dependably. This broad effort became known as the Good Roads Movement. Among its prominent early supporters was the League of American Wheelmen. Bicycling had become popular late in the 19th century, and cyclists knew every rough stone, deep rut, and muddy hollow in the roads they traveled. Farmers had their own reasons for supporting improvement. A reliable road made it easier to reach a market before food spoiled. It connected farms to railway stations, schools, stores, churches, and neighboring towns. A passable road in every season was not simply a convenience. It could be an essential connection to the wider world. The expansion of rural free delivery around the turn of the century strengthened the practical argument. If mail was to reach homes in the countryside, postal carriers needed routes that could be traveled in rain, cold, and spring thaw. A rural mailbox beside an improved road became a small sign of a larger national connection. The federal government had begun taking an interest in road improvement in 1893, when it established the Office of Road Inquiry. This office collected information and promoted better building methods. It did not demand a national road network, and it did not directly build every road. Its work was quieter. It studied surfaces, shared knowledge, and encouraged useful practices. That office became an institutional predecessor of the Federal Highway Administration, the first major step toward a continuing partnership between the federal government and the states, came with the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. The law used matching funds. This meant that federal money was supplied when a state contributed an agreed share of its own. Federal aid was national funding, offered under rules to support state projects. It did not mean that Washington owned every road or sent federal crews to construct each mile. States needed suitable highway agencies to participate. These state highway departments planned projects, managed work, and accepted responsibility for the roads. The arrangement reflected a form of shared government known as federalism. National and state governments took different parts of the same task. The first program moved slowly. American participation in the First World War drew away materials, workers, and attention. Administrative difficulties also delayed projects. The 1916 law created an important structure, but it did not produce anything like a national superhighway system. In 1921, Congress refined the partnership through the Federal Highway Act. This law concentrated federal assistance on a selected system of major roads, rather than spreading it across every local route. It was a significant change in thought. Not every road could be improved at once. A connected group of important routes might serve long-distance and regional movement more effectively than many scattered projects. The 1921 law also strengthened state highway departments, which became increasingly important in planning, construction, and maintenance. Even then, road improvements spread unevenly. A major route might receive a new stone surface while nearby roads remained unpaved. One county might have a strong highway agency, while another struggled with limited money and equipment. Across open farmland, road graders moved in slow, repeated passes. Workers shaped the earth, placed drainage, and spread pale crushed stone. The newly improved road looked firm in the morning light. Nearby, rain still gathered in the old wagon ruts. With each project, however, the road ahead seemed a little more inviting. Drivers began to look beyond the next town. If one improved road joined another, perhaps a journey could continue across a county, then across a state, and perhaps much farther. But a longer journey required more than a passable surface. It also required guidance. A driver needed to know which turn to take, which town came next, and how separate local roads could form one continuous route. Soon, folded maps, painted symbols, and roadside markers would help travelers imagine the roads not as isolated pieces, but as a connected national network. Chapter 3. Learning to Think in Networks. Picture an early motorist pausing at the edge of a small town. A folded paper map opens across the seat. The roads printed on it are sometimes uncertain, and the route ahead may be only partly marked. The traveler faces a simple question. How does one road become a journey? How do the separate pieces join into a route that might carry someone hundreds or even thousands of miles? In the early years of automobile travel, an answer often came from named auto trails. These routes were promoted by private associations. Groups of motorists, civic leaders, and business owners identified chains of existing roads, gave them memorable names, and marked them for travelers. An auto trail was not usually a newly constructed road. It was assembled from roads already present. Those roads could differ greatly from one place to another. A smooth surface might become gravel, and gravel might become dirt. A route could pass along town streets, over narrow bridges, and through country crossroads. Colored bands painted on poles helped travelers recognize a trail. Signs appeared on fences, posts, and buildings. At a confusing intersection, a driver might slow down, search for the right mark, and then continue toward the next town. One of the most famous auto trails was the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway Association was organized in 1913 and promoted a route from New York City to San Francisco. The idea of a named road reaching from one coast to the other captured public imagination. Yet the Lincoln Highway was not a uniform highway built by the federal government. It was a collection of existing roads gathered beneath one name. Some sections were improved, while others remained rough. Rain could still transform part of the route into mud. Many other named trails appeared. Their abundance created confusion. Trails overlapped and competed with one another. A single road might display several sets of colors and names. At some intersections, a traveler could find so many markings that the signs intended to provide guidance became another source of uncertainty. In 1926, state highway officials approved a more orderly arrangement called the United States Highway System. Instead of relying mainly on trail names and privately painted markings, travelers could follow route numbers displayed on recognizable shields. The routes were coordinated nationally, but they were generally owned and maintained by the states. The numbering followed a broad pattern. Primary routes with odd numbers generally ran north and south. Primary routes with even numbers generally ran east and west. Numbers generally increased from east to west and from north to south. There were exceptions, as there usually are in a network built across varied landscapes and inherited roads. Still, the pattern gave travelers a useful structure. A number could continue across a state boundary without losing its identity. Among the roads designated in 1926 was U.S. Route 66. It connected Chicago and Los Angeles, although its exact alignment changed in places during its lifetime. Route 66 later became famous in stories, songs, photographs, and memory. It was not an interstate. Like other U.S. highways, it included ordinary intersections, roadside entrances, town streets, and two-lane sections. Its appearance and quality varied along the way. The remembered image of Route 66 combines documented history with later nostalgia. In 1985, Route 66 was officially removed from the U.S. highway system. Interstate highways and other roads had taken over much of its long-distance function. Even after the designation disappeared, however, its cultural image remained. As automobile travel grew, new businesses gathered beside the roads. Filling stations offered fuel beneath lights that glowed warmly at dusk. Garages repaired engines, tires, and mechanical parts. Diners served meals to passing travelers. Campgrounds provided simple places to sleep. Motor courts arranged individual rooms around a courtyard, often allowing guests to park close to their doors. Road travel began to develop its own quiet routines. A driver watched the fuel gauge, listened for unusual sounds from the engine, and looked ahead for the next town. A family unfolded a map across a restaurant table. At night, headlamps illuminated only a small piece of road, while the rest of the route continued unseen beyond the light. The paper map and the route shield performed a subtle but important task. They helped people picture distant roads as parts of one connected whole. A traveler could trace a finger across a map and imagine the route passing through states not yet visited. Americans were learning to think in networks. Still, a number could not make a road strong. A shield did not drain water from the surface, widen a narrow bridge, or soften a steep grade. National coordination made navigation easier, but road quality remained inconsistent. The difference between a clean line on a map and a dependable road across real terrain could be very large. That difference became especially clear when heavy vehicles attempted a long journey together, testing roads, bridges, engines, and patience across the full width of the country. Chapter 4: Convoys, Surveys, and Early Plans. In the summer of 1919, a long line of vehicles departed from Washington, D.C. The destination was San Francisco, on the distant Pacific coast. This was a United States Army motor convoy. It was both a journey and a practical study. The Army wanted to understand what it would mean to move many vehicles across the country, using the roads as they actually existed. For much of the journey, the convoy followed the Lincoln Highway. It left Washington on July 7th and reached San Francisco on September 6th. The crossing took about 2 months. The convoy included dozens of vehicles and roughly 300 participants. Published totals vary because records and later summaries count support vehicles and personnel in different ways. What matters most is the scale of the undertaking. It was a long, patient procession of trucks, cars, repair vehicles, and people moving together across a difficult landscape. Among the participants was Dwight D. Eisenhower, then a young Army officer. He traveled as an observer. He was not the convoy commander. The journey offered a thorough education in the limitations of the road system. Mud swallowed wheels, loose sand slowed vehicles in drier country. Steep grades placed strain on engines. Mechanical trouble was common. Some roads were narrow, deeply rutted, or too rough for heavy traffic. Bridges presented another concern. Some were weak or uncertain. Vehicles crossed carefully one at a time, leaving space between them. A bridge might creak beneath the weight, while the rest of the convoy waited quietly on the bank. The journey revealed both the possibility and the difficulty of motor travel. Vehicles could cross the country, but the trip was slow and demanding. Dependable long-distance movement required stronger roads, better surfaces, improved bridges, and more consistent standards. Eisenhower remembered the convoy in later years. It became one influence on his thinking about highways, yet it was not the single moment in which the interstate system was invented. The later network emerged from many experiences, studies, engineering experiments, and political decisions over several decades. 3 years after the convoy, another stage of planning appeared in the form of the Pershing map. Prepared in 1922, the map identified roads considered important for national defense. The work involved General John J. Pershing, the Bureau of Public Roads, and state highway officials. The Bureau of Public Roads was the federal road agency of the time. Through later institutional changes, it eventually evolved into the Federal Highway Administration. The roads on the Pershing map formed a broad strategic network. A strategic route was one judged useful for defense or emergency movement. The map helped planners consider which roads might deserve priority if people, equipment, and employers emerged from this journey, or supplies had to move over long distances. It was not a detailed blueprint for the future interstate system. It reflected the knowledge and needs of its own time. Like the 1919 convoy, it was one part of a gradual process. Across the country, planners were collecting more information. Traffic counts recorded how many vehicles used a road. Bridge inspections examined strength and condition. Surveys measured distance, slope, elevation, and location. A surveyor might set a level on a tripod in the morning haze. Notes were written beneath the shade of a tree. Fine marks accumulated on large sheets of paper. Each observation made the national picture a little clearer. Maps simplify the landscapes they describe. A road appears as a neat line, perhaps no wider than a pencil stroke, yet the actual route must cross soil, water, property, farms, hills, and towns. It rises through grades that a map cannot feel. It passes over rivers, shown only as narrow blue threads. Planning required the clean line and the lived landscape to be considered together. Engineers needed to know whether the ground could support a road, whether water could be carried away, and whether a bridge could bear the expected weight. Gradually, road planning became more systematic. State agencies gained experience. The federal government collected knowledge and offered standards. Engineers compared surfaces, bridge types, and routes. The country had not yet agreed to build a national controlled access system, but it was learning how to observe transportation as a whole. Dust settled after the convoy passed. Survey notes accumulated in offices. Maps were rolled, stored, reopened, and revised. In the following decades, public works, parkways, turnpikes, and wartime transportation needs would provide practical examples of a newer kind of road. Chapter 5. From Depression-era roads to wartime lessons. The years of the Great Depression brought hardship to communities across the country. They also brought a broad program of public construction, intended in part to provide work. New Deal agencies supported roads, bridges, roadside improvements, and other infrastructure. The Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration were both involved, although their projects differed in size, purpose, and administration. Crews set stone beside streams, concrete was poured into wooden forms, bridges rose above rivers, and road surfaces were repaired or extended. These programs did not build the interstate highway system. That larger project still lay in the future, but the work expanded public infrastructure and deepened the country's engineering experience. At the same time, a particular kind of road was demonstrating new possibilities. Parkways had begun developing before the New Deal. One influential example was the Bronx River Parkway. Roads like this often combined practical movement with a carefully designed landscape. Trees arched over portions of the roadway, and curves followed the terrain. Parkways introduced or refined several features later associated with expressways. Some used divided roadways, with traffic moving in opposite directions separated by a median. A median is the space between opposing streams of traffic. It might be broad and planted with grass, or narrow and protected by a barrier. Other roads crossed the parkway by bridges instead of meeting it at an ordinary intersection. This was called grade separation. One road passed above or below another, allowing traffic to continue without stopping at the crossing. Parkways also limited direct access from neighboring property. Drivers entered and left at selected points, rather than at every driveway. This arrangement is called controlled access. Early parkways were not the same as later interstates. Some restricted trucks, some included curves or dimensions that would not suit modern highway speeds. Yet they allowed engineers and travelers to experience roads designed for continuous movement. In 1940, the Pennsylvania Turnpike opened. It offered high-speed, limited-access travel between cities. Long stretches crossed the hills with relatively gentle grades. Drivers entered through designated points and paid tolls to use the road. A toll booth glowing after sunset became part of the turnpike landscape. The road demonstrated that travelers would use and pay for a controlled-access intercity highway. That same year, the Arroyo Seco Parkway opened between Los Angeles and Pasadena. It was an early urban freeway, carrying automobiles through a developed region. Its short ramps and sharper curves differed from later interstate design, but it offered another practical example of traffic moving without ordinary intersections. These roads did not suddenly reveal one perfect design. Rather, they added to a growing collection of experience. Engineers could study divided traffic, ramps, bridges, pavement, drainage, and access control under real conditions. During the Second World War, dependable domestic transportation became especially important. Roads connected factories, ports, military installations, warehouses, and communities. They helped move workers, materials, and supplies within the country. Defense was one reason to think about stronger roads, but it was never the only reason. Civilian traffic was also growing. Businesses wanted reliable freight movement. Drivers wanted safer travel. Metropolitan areas were spreading outward, and older routes were becoming crowded. During and after the war, Eisenhower observed Germany's Autobahn network. He admired aspects of its controlled access design and its usefulness for moving traffic over long distances. It would be misleading, however, to say that the American interstate system was simply copied from the Autobahn. American engineers and planners had already studied parkways, turnpikes, grade-separated roads, and national highway networks. Federal reports and state projects had developed many similar ideas before Eisenhower saw the German highways. The Autobahn was one influence among several. The 1919 convoy was another. So were the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the Bronx River Parkway, the Arroyo Seco Parkway, federal road studies, rising automobile use, commercial needs, safety concerns, defense planning, and the growth of metropolitan regions. The future system emerged from these overlapping lessons. No single road, person, or event created it. By the end of the war years, the idea of a modern national network had become easier to picture. A driver could imagine divided lanes extending beyond a single parkway. An engineer could imagine bridges carrying cross-traffic overhead. A planner could imagine controlled access routes linking cities and regions. But examples were not enough. A national network required legal authority, an agreed map, cooperation among governments, and a dependable source of money. The view now shifted from the pavement to the drafting table. Rolled plans rested beside traffic reports. Pencils moved across translucent map sheets. The lines were becoming clearer, but the method of building them remained unresolved. Chapter 6. Designing a National System. During the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took an interest in the possibility of long-distance highways. The idea was appealing, but important questions remained. How much traffic would these roads carry? Could tolls pay for construction? Should new highways follow existing routes, pass around cities, or enter them? And which regions should be connected first? A federal report published in 1939 examined some of these questions. Its title was Toll Roads and Free Roads. The report considered the idea of a small number of transcontinental toll roads. It concluded that such routes would not carry enough traffic to pay for themselves everywhere. A busy segment near a city might attract many drivers, while a remote stretch might not earn enough toll revenue to cover its cost. Instead, the report recommended a broader system of modern highways. This system would include improvements to existing roads and routes around or through metropolitan areas. A second report, Interregional Highways, appeared in 1941. It developed the concept further and described a network of roughly 39,000 miles connecting broad regions of the country. Interregional meant more than linking neighboring towns. It meant joining major population centers, economic regions, and transportation corridors over long distances. In 1944, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act. The law authorized a national system of interstate highways of up to 40,000 miles. Authorization meant legal permission to establish a program. It did not necessarily mean that enough money had been provided to carry it out. An appropriation, by contrast, is money formally supplied for spending. The 1944 law authorized the system, but it did not provide a dedicated and adequate method of funding construction on the scale planners imagined. As a result, progress remained limited. In 1947, the first routes in the proposed interstate system were formally designated. Urban connections were added and revised later. Lines now appeared on official maps, but many remained plans rather than completed roads. After the Second World War, the pressure on transportation systems increased. Automobile ownership rose, freight traffic grew. New housing appeared at the edges of metropolitan areas. Evening headlights gathered along city approaches, where older streets and two-lane highways struggled to carry more vehicles than they had been designed for. Suburban growth had many causes. Federal housing policy influenced where loans and development occurred. Local zoning shaped the form of communities. Income growth allowed more families to purchase houses and automobiles. Land at metropolitan edges was often less expensive. Racial discrimination also played a major role. Housing policies and practices limited where many black families and other groups could live or obtain financing. The geography of post-war development cannot be understood without recognizing these unequal conditions. Highways did not create the suburbs by themselves. They supported and accelerated outward growth, making longer automobile journeys between home and work more practical. By the early 1950s, many people agreed that road capacity needed to increase. Agreement on the problem did not create agreement on the solution. In 1954, President Eisenhower promoted what became known as a Grand Plan for Highway Development. He supported a large national network, drawing on decades of planning and on his own observations of transportation in the United States and abroad. A committee led by Lucius Clay recommended a major construction program. Its preferred financing method relied heavily on bonds, which are borrowed funds that must later be repaid. That approach did not win congressional approval. Other proposals continued to move through Congress. Senator Albert Gore Sr. and Representative George Fallon were among the important congressional figures who helped shape the legislation that eventually passed. The final agreement did not belong to one person or institution. It emerged through negotiation among the administration, members of Congress, state highway officials, engineers, industry groups, and others with an interest in transportation. This shared structure reflected federalism once again. The national government could establish standards and provide much of the funding. States would choose many exact alignments, acquire land, supervise projects, and maintain the roads. Local governments would influence land use and connections. On a national map, the proposed system looked calm and orderly. Fine lines crossed from region to region, yet every line raised local questions. Would the road follow an existing valley? Would it bypass a town? Where would an interchange be placed? What land would become right-of-way, meaning land reserved for the highway? Plans accumulated on tables, traffic counts filled reports. The system had legal recognition and broad support, but the central funding question remained. Then, in the summer of 1956, the long negotiation reached its decisive legislative agreement. Chapter 7. The Act of 1956. On June 29, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The act authorized a 41,000-mile interstate program. Congress later expanded the authorized mileage. The official name became the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. In 1990, the system was renamed in Eisenhower's honor. The 1956 Act did not invent national highway planning. Earlier laws, reports, maps, and construction projects had already established much of the foundation. What the law provided was the organizational and financial breakthrough needed to begin building on a much larger scale. A companion measure, the Highway Revenue Act of 1956, created the Highway Trust Fund. This was a federal account that received designated highway-related taxes and supported transportation programs. The federal gasoline tax increased from 2 cents to 3 cents per gallon. Revenue from this and other designated sources helped provide a continuing stream of money. For most interstate construction, the federal government paid 90% and the states paid 10%. Special rules applied in some circumstances, but the 90-10 partnership became one of the defining features of the program. Even with the federal government providing most of the money, states generally owned the highways, managed construction, maintained the roads, and policed them. The system was national in funding, standards, and identity, but much of its daily operation remained a state responsibility. The initial effort was often described as a 13-year program costing roughly $25 billion. Construction lasted far longer and eventually cost much more in the nominal dollars of later years. Nominal dollars are simply the amount stated for their own time, without adjustment for inflation. The planned highways followed broad engineering standards. Opposing traffic would generally travel on divided roadways. Entry and exit would be controlled. Interchanges would connect major roads without ordinary intersections. An interchange is a system of ramps allowing vehicles to move between roads without crossing other traffic at the same level. A looping ramp could carry a driver onto the main highway without a stoplight. Roads would usually include shoulders, the strips beside travel lanes that provide space for emergencies and structural support. Medians would separate traffic moving in opposite directions. Bridges and pavement would be designed for durability. Signs and lane markings would become increasingly consistent. Federal officials worked with the American Association of State Highway Officials, now known as AAHSTO, to develop standards. The standards created a recognizable national experience, although geography, inherited roads, and engineering established much of the foundation, and approved exceptions produced variation. Interstate numbering followed a pattern that generally reversed the older U.S. highway arrangement. Even-numbered primary interstates usually ran east and west, with numbers increasing from south to north. Odd-numbered primary routes usually ran north and south, with numbers increasing from west to east. Three-digit interstate numbers generally identified auxiliary routes, such as loops, bypasses, and spurs. As with other numbering systems, exceptions existed. The word interstate did not mean that every route had to cross a state boundary. It referred to membership in the national system. Hawaii, for example, has signed interstate highways even though no road can connect the islands to another state. Nor did membership mean every highway was toll-free. Some existing turnpikes that met, or could be adapted to, federal standards became part of the network. The defense purpose was real, but the system was not built only for military movement. It was also intended to support civilian travel, commerce, safety, and regional connection. One persistent story claimed that 1 mile in every 5 had to be straight so aircraft could land on the road. No such nationwide interstate requirement existed. The reality was less dramatic and more practical. Highways had to curve around mountains, cross rivers, pass through developed areas, and respond to local terrain. Design was standardized, but never completely uniform. With the law signed, route maps unfolded across state offices. Green guide signs with white lettering became symbols of a network still largely unbuilt. Survey crews moved into fields. Engineers examined soils and waterways. The signature did not complete the system. It began a long era of construction, one that unfolded in many places at once. Across the country, survey flags stirred lightly in the breeze. A level stood on a tripod in the morning haze. Soon, earth-moving machines began their steady work. Chapter 8. Building the Roads. Interstate construction did not begin at one coast and move neatly toward the other. It took place across many states at the same time. One project crossed farmland. Another climbed through mountains. A third entered a city. Elsewhere, crews widened an older turnpike or built a bridge above a broad river. Before the first earth mover arrived, planners studied possible corridors. Engineers estimated future traffic. Surveyors measured the terrain. Agencies acquired right-of-way, the land reserved for the road and its structures. Each line on the map had to become a precise path on the ground. The process began with measurement. Survey crews established locations and elevations. Small flags marked points in fields and along hillsides. Instruments on tripods helped determine slope and alignment. Once a route was chosen, grading gave the land its planned form. Grading means cutting and filling earth to create manageable slopes and a stable roadbed. In one place, machines removed soil and stone from a hill. In another, material filled a low area. Earth movers crossed broad cuts and slow, repeated paths. Each pass changed the shape of the ground a little more. Compaction followed. Heavy equipment pressed soil and stone into dense, stable layers. A highway was not simply asphalt or concrete laid upon bare earth. Beneath the visible surface were engineered layers of prepared soil, aggregate, and base material. Aggregate is crushed stone, gravel, or similar material used in construction. The exact combination varied with climate, soil, traffic, and local design. Some interstate surfaces were made with concrete, others used asphalt. Both rested on supporting layers designed to spread weight and resist movement. Water had to be considered at every stage. Drainage is one of the quiet foundations of a durable road. Rainwater that remains beneath or beside pavement can weaken the roadbed and damage the surface. Ditches and sloped surfaces guided water away. Inlets collected it. Culverts, which are pipes or passages beneath a road, carried streams and runoff from one side to the other. After rain, water moved through a newly placed culvert while the pavement above remained dry. Bridges required their own sequence of work. Foundations transferred weight into the ground. Abutments supported the ends. Piers rose between them where needed. Beams or girders were lowered carefully into place. Above these supports came the bridge deck, barriers, joints, and other details. Expansion features allowed materials to respond to changing temperatures. Steel and concrete moved slightly with heat and cold, even when the bridge appeared perfectly still. Most modern interstate construction uses lanes 12 feet wide, though older or constrained sections can differ. Medians separate opposing traffic and reduce the risk of head-on collisions. Where space is limited, barriers may stand within a narrow median. Curves are sometimes banked slightly. This is called superelevation. The outer edge of the pavement rises above the inner edge, helping vehicles follow the curve more smoothly. Signs became more standardized. Reflective materials improved visibility at night. Fresh lane markings appeared bright against dark pavement. A traveler moving from one state to another could recognize familiar shapes, colors, and symbols. The work depended on many kinds of skill. Surveyors measured, equipment operators moved earth, steel workers assembled bridges, concrete crews placed and finished decks and pavement. Electricians installed lighting and signals. Landscapers stabilized exposed soil. Inspectors checked materials and dimensions. The rhythm was steady, but the process was not always orderly. Projects encountered bad weather, accidents, legal challenges, disputes over routes, changing costs, and delays in acquiring land. Construction could consume large quantities of material and alter rivers, hillsides, farms, wetlands, and city blocks. A completed section did not remain new forever. Even as fresh roads opened, older pavement began its slow exposure to heat, cold, rain, salt, and heavy vehicles. Completion was never permanent. Still, for a time, each newly opened segment appeared clean and precise. Lane markings extended toward the horizon, bridges passed overhead, ramps joined the roadway in long curves. The work had turned map lines into pavement. Yet every corridor crossed more than contours and soil. In cities especially, the right-of-way could pass through homes, businesses, parks, churches, and long-established neighborhoods. The road was an engineering structure, but it was also a decision about land, and the consequences of those decisions were not shared equally. Chapter 9: Cities, Neighborhoods, and Difficult Choices. Urban highways presented some of the most difficult and lasting choices in the history of the interstate system. A route entering a city needed land for lanes, shoulders, ramps, retaining walls, and interchanges. Officials had to decide which streets would be crossed, which buildings would be removed, and which neighborhoods would be divided. On a planning map, a proposed corridor might appear as a broad line through the city grid. On the ground, that line passed through homes, shops, parks, churches, clubs, schools, and familiar gathering places. Officials often favored land considered less expensive to acquire. Yet ideas about value were shaped by segregation, redlining, discriminatory housing policy, urban renewal, and unequal political power. Redlining refers to historic practices that denied loans and investment to neighborhoods, often on the basis of race. These practices reduced property values and limited opportunities. Later, when highway planners sought lower-cost corridors, the same neighborhoods were more likely to be treated as available for demolition. Black, immigrant, and lower-income communities were disproportionately affected in many cities. Some white working-class neighborhoods were also divided or displaced. The effects went far beyond the loss of buildings. Residents were forced or pressured to move. Businesses lost customers and locations. Streets no longer connected in familiar ways. A short walk to a school, park, or shop could become a difficult crossing beneath an elevated road or around a wide interchange. Noise and air pollution became part of daily life. Pedestrian access declined. Community institutions and social ties were disrupted. Property wealth accumulated over many years could be diminished or lost. In St. Paul, Interstate 94 cut through Rondo, a long-established black neighborhood. Homes and businesses were removed, and the community was divided. In Miami, expressway construction, including Interstate 95, displaced residents and damaged Overtown, an important black business and cultural district. In Detroit, urban renewal and freeway projects, including Interstate 75, contributed to the destruction and division of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. In New Orleans, Interstate 10 was built above Claiborne Avenue, once a tree-lined commercial and community corridor in a predominantly black neighborhood. Concrete columns and elevated lanes changed the character of the avenue below. The effects were not identical in every city, and not every route was chosen for the same reason. Local geography, existing roads, cost, engineering, and political choices all varied. Even so, structural discrimination is a well-documented part of the story. Urban highway construction also harmed some white working-class and immigrant communities. The Cross Bronx Expressway, for example, cut through established neighborhoods and became associated with displacement and urban disruption. Residents did not always accept these plans quietly. They attended hearings, organized neighborhood groups, filed lawsuits, held protests, and appealed to elected officials. These movements became known collectively as freeway revolts. Some campaigns stopped proposed roads. Others changed alignments, reduced projects, or delayed construction. Opposition altered or canceled freeways in cities including San Francisco, Washington, Baltimore, and New Orleans. Success was uneven. Communities with greater political influence often had a better chance of protecting themselves, while others struggled to be heard. Federal law gradually required greater attention to environmental and community effects. The Department of Transportation Act of 1966 included Section 4F, which placed protections around parks, recreation areas, wildlife refuges, and historic sites under certain conditions. The National Environmental Policy Act, signed in 1970, required formal study of environmental effects and alternatives for major federal actions. Also in 1970, the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act established more consistent standards for relocation and land acquisition. These measures improved the planning process, but they arrived after many harmful projects had already begun or been completed. Relocation payments could not necessarily replace a community network, restore an institution, or provide property of equal value. In recent years, some cities have considered ways to reconnect places divided by highways. A highway cap can place a deck over a sunken roadway, sometimes supporting a park or buildings. Other options include redesigned interchanges, transit improvements, boulevard conversions, or removal of selected road sections. Such projects can improve access and create new public space. They cannot automatically restore the homes, businesses, relationships, or wealth that were lost. Beneath an elevated roadway, an older street grid may still be visible. Afternoon light passes between concrete columns. A pedestrian bridge joins two sides of a divided district. The interstate system brought broad mobility to many travelers. It also placed heavy burdens on communities with less power to resist. Both realities belong to the same history. From these divided streets, the view widens again. The roads continued outward, changing freight, tourism, commuting, roadside business, and the daily meaning of distance. Chapter 10: A Country Reshaped by Travel. As the interstate network expanded, Long-distance travel became faster and more predictable along many routes. A journey that once passed through the center of every town could move around local streets on a bypass. Traffic lights and ordinary intersections became less frequent. Drivers entered at a ramp, settled into a lane, and watched mile markers pass. Divided traffic, controlled access, gentler curves, and grade-separated crossings generally made interstates safer per mile traveled than many older undivided highways. Risk did not disappear. High speed can make crashes severe. Safety continues to depend on road design, maintenance, weather, vehicle condition, speed, and driver behavior. A well-designed road can reduce certain dangers, but it cannot remove them all. Freight movement changed significantly. Trucking had already expanded after the Second World War for many reasons. Interstates made long-distance truck travel faster and more dependable, particularly for time-sensitive and door-to-door shipments. Trucks moved in steady lines across distant bridges. Warehouses gathered near interchanges, where goods could be transferred and distributed. Factories and offices also appeared beside highway exits. Railways continued to carry large quantities of bulk freight. The decline of passenger rail on many routes had several causes, including airline competition, regulation, investment decisions, suburbanization, and changing travel preferences. Highways were part of that history, but they were not the only cause. Interchanges became new centers of economic activity. Shopping centers, motels, restaurants, filling stations, offices, and industrial parks opened near ramps. Some towns gained easier access to visitors and markets. Other places lost through traffic when bypasses opened. A diner or filling station on an older highway might see fewer customers once travelers moved to the interstate. A downtown that had once depended on passing motorists could become quieter. The gains near one interchange were sometimes accompanied by losses along the road left behind. Interstate travel encouraged nationally recognizable hotel, fuel, and restaurant chains. Their signs offered familiarity to travelers far from home. Independent businesses remained important, but the roadside became more standardized in many places. Federal law generally prohibited commercial service areas directly on the rights-of-way of newly built interstates. Travelers usually left at an interchange to buy fuel or food. Older toll roads and certain facilities allowed under earlier arrangements were exceptions. Some turnpikes continued to offer commercial service plazas directly along the route. Ordinary interstate rest areas were quieter. They usually provided parking, restrooms, picnic tables, maps, and landscaped grounds, rather than full commercial services. A family might stop beneath tall shade trees. Trucks rested at the far edge of the lot. Wind moved softly through the grass. After a few minutes, the travelers returned to the road. Interstates also supported commuting and metropolitan expansion. People could live farther from workplaces, shops, and schools. This offered flexibility to some families, but it also deepened dependence on automobiles. When driving becomes easier because lanes are added or a new highway opens, more people may choose to drive, take longer trips, or travel at busier times. This is called induced demand. As additional trips appear, the expected relief from congestion may not last. Highways also produce environmental effects. Vehicle emissions affect air quality and contribute to greenhouse gases. Noise reaches nearby homes and natural areas. Rainwater flows from pavement as runoff, carrying heat and pollutants towards soil and waterways. Roads can divide habitats into smaller, less connected pieces, a process known as habitat fragmentation. Construction requires land, stone, concrete, asphalt, steel, and energy. Modern vehicles emit far less of several harmful pollutants per mile than older vehicles because of regulation and technological change. Yet total traffic volume remains high, and carbon emissions continue to be a major concern. The interstate changed distance but did not eliminate it. A long journey still unfolded mile by mile. Windshield wipers kept a slow rhythm in light rain. A radio played quietly. Motel signs glowed at the edge of evening. Red taillights followed the curve of a mountain pass. The road made movement more predictable, and it reshaped where people lived, worked, traded, and rested, became both infrastructure and landscape, familiar enough to seem permanent. Yet it was never permanent. Beneath every passing vehicle, pavement wore slowly away. Bridges aged, signs faded, drainage systems filled and cleared. The network required constant attention. The story of the interstate was moving from expansion toward maintenance, reconstruction, and reconsideration. Chapter 11. The Road That Continues. There is no single, uncontested date when the interstate highway system became fully finished. One date is often commemorated. On October 14, 1992, Interstate 70 opened through Glenwood Canyon in Colorado. The completion of this difficult mountain segment was widely described as the completion of the original interstate system. The description is useful, but it requires care. Some routes proposed in earlier plans had been canceled. Some older roads entered the system even though their designs varied from later standards. Gaps, new designations, reclassifications, and major rebuilding continued after 1992. The system did not become fixed on that day. It continued to change. Today it contains nearly 49,000 route miles. The total shifts slightly as new sections are approved or existing roads are reclassified. The network includes routes in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, though signs and design standards vary. Hawaii's H1, H2, and H3 carry familiar interstate shields even though they do not cross state boundaries. Some federally designated interstate routes in Alaska and Puerto Rico are not marked with the usual shields and do not meet every conventional interstate standard. The national system has always combined standardization with variation. Most interstate highways remain the responsibility of state agencies, supported through a combination of federal and state funding. States inspect bridges, repair pavement, manage traffic, clear snow, maintain signs, and plan reconstruction. Roads wear slowly and continuously. Heavy vehicles place repeated loads on pavement and bridges. Water enters small openings. Heat expands materials and cold contracts them. In colder regions, freezing and thawing can widen cracks. Salt used in winter can affect concrete and steel. A road may be resurfaced many times. A bridge deck may need replacement. Steel may require painting. Foundations, barriers, drainage, and joints must be inspected and repaired. Reconstruction means rebuilding substantial parts of an existing road rather than making a minor repair. It can be more difficult than building on open land, especially in cities where highways are constrained by buildings, utilities, waterways, and constant traffic. Boston's Central Artery and Tunnel Project, commonly called the Big Dig, offers one example of the complexity of later rebuilding. Part of Interstate 93 was moved underground. The project improved some surface connections, but it was unusually costly and difficult. Across the country, transportation priorities continue to change. Many agencies now focus less on extending roads into new territory and more on repairing and adapting the network already in place. Aging bridges and pavement require attention. Safety improvements can change interchanges, barriers, signs, lighting, and road geometry. Stormwater systems must respond to heavy rain and changing conditions. Resilience is the ability of infrastructure to withstand and recover from floods, heat, storms, and other stresses. Building resilience may involve better drainage, stronger structures, revised materials, and plans for emergency repair. Electric vehicle charging is becoming part of the highway landscape. Charging stations may glow quietly beside parked cars at a rest stop or interchange. Electric vehicles remove tailpipe emissions, meaning pollution released directly from exhaust. They still require energy, roads, parking, and other infrastructure. They do not by themselves solve congestion, road danger, or the effects of land use. Wildlife crossings are another adaptation. A crossing may be a bridge planted with grass and shrubs, a tunnel, or a specially designed culvert. When placed according to evidence about animal movement, these structures can reduce collisions and reconnect habitat divided by roads. Transportation planning also increasingly considers connections with public transit, walking, and cycling. A highway remains useful for many journeys, but it exists within a larger transportation system. Some communities are exploring ways to repair divisions created by earlier urban highway construction. Plans may include highway caps, redesigned interchanges, transit investment, or boulevard conversion. A boulevard conversion replaces or redesigns a high-speed roadway as a lower-speed urban street. In a few places, selected road segments may be removed. In others, parks or pedestrian routes may cross above a sunken freeway. These efforts can improve access and create new connections. They cannot automatically return lost homes, restore every institution, or replace community wealth accumulated over generations. Repairing a physical division is not the same as reversing all of its history. And so the interstate system remains unfinished, not because its roads do not connect, but because a working network is never complete in any final sense. Maps are revised, bridges are rebuilt, pavement is renewed, new priorities appear beside old structures. The same road may carry freight, family journeys, emergency traffic, buses, commuters, and travelers who simply wish to see what lies beyond the next horizon. Late at night, after traffic has thinned, repair crews work beneath amber lamps. A lane closes gently around them. Fresh bridge joints wait beneath the lights. In the distance, the road curves toward a city whose windows shine against the dark. Later, the work zone passes. The lanes open again. Tires make a low, steady sound against the pavement. Green signs appear in the headlights and fade behind. A bridge rises over dark water. Farther on, a rest area waits beneath quiet trees. Beyond the reach of the headlights, the road continues through landscapes that have always guided movement. It follows valleys and crosses plains. It enters mountain gaps, passes towns, and bends around rivers. Beneath parts of its route lie the histories of older paths, wagon roads, canals, railways, numbered highways, surveys, and plans. Around it are communities shaped by both connection and division. Ahead are repairs not yet made and choices not yet settled. The interstate is not a perfect line across a map, and it was never the work of one moment or one person. It is a national project formed over generations, built through cooperation and conflict, and carried forward through maintenance, memory, and change. Distant lights rise, hold for a moment, and slowly fade. The pavement hums beneath the tires, and the long road across America stretches onward into the quiet, unseen horizon.